Sometimes the loneliest people have the biggest hearts, and sometimes saving someone else is really about saving yourself. At 70 years old, Chester Hawkins knows both truths better than most. High in the Colorado mountains, Chester lives alone with his old dog Scout in a cabin that's seen 15 winters of grief since his wife passed and his son stopped calling. He's made peace with the silence, the long days chopping wood, and the nights when memories are his only company. When an early blizzard brings a half-frozen stranger to his doorstep, Chester does what any decent man would do. He saves her life. What he doesn't know is that this mysterious woman carries secrets that will change everything he thought he understood about second chances, family, and the unexpected ways two broken souls can heal each other. What happens when a simple act of kindness collides with extraordinary wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Eagle's Rest Peak like an old man's memories, soft and persistent, refusing to let go until the sun burned it away. Chester Hawkins stood on his cabin's front porch, steam rising from his coffee cup in the crisp October air, watching the familiar dance of light and shadow across the valley floor below. At 70, he'd witnessed this same ritual over 5,000 times, yet it never lost its power to center his soul. Scout emerged from the cabin behind him, the old hound's graying muzzle testament to their shared journey through the years. The dog's leather collar, worn smooth by mountain weather and countless adventures, bore the scars of their life together, a life that had grown quieter with each passing season. Chester reached down to scratch behind Scout's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of his companion's presence. "Another day, old friend," Chester murmured, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. Scout's tail wagged once, a measured response that spoke of understanding built over years of shared solitude. The cabin itself stood as a monument to Chester's philosophy of self-reliance. Built from lodgepole pines he'd felled himself, chinked with mountain clay and river stones, it nestled against the tree line like it had grown there naturally. Every board, every joint, every carefully fitted window frame bore the mark of his hands. Martha had always said he built things the way he lived, solid, dependable, meant to last. Martha, even after 15 years, her absence still caught him at unexpected moments. This morning ritual had been theirs once, standing together as the mountain awakened, planning their day over shared coffee and comfortable silence. She'd been the one who convinced him to leave the city after his military service to find peace in these high places, where the air was thin and the world's noise couldn't follow. Their bedroom window still faced east, just as she'd insisted, so the morning light would wake them gently. Chester hadn't been able to bring himself to change much about the cabin since her passing. Her coffee cup still sat in the cupboard, washed and waiting. Her favorite quilt still lay folded at the foot of their bed, though he slept alone now, beneath blankets that seemed too large for one man's grief. The cancer had taken her slowly, giving them time to say everything that needed saying. Time to hold each other through the long nights, when pain made sleep impossible. She died in spring, when the aspens were budding and the creek ran high with snowmelt. Chester had buried her in the small cemetery down in Millfield, 20 miles of winding mountain road from their cabin, because she'd asked to rest among neighbors rather than in the isolated ground she'd loved in life. Scout padded down the porch steps and into the burr yard, nose to the ground, following scent trails invisible to human senses. At 12 years old, the dog moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, but his instincts remained sharp. Chester had found Scout as a puppy, abandoned on a Forest Service road, and they'd been inseparable ever since. The dog had been Martha's shadow during her illness, seeming to understand her pain in ways that transcended species. Chester's son Danny had visited twice since Martha's funeral, awkward, duty-bound appearances that left both men feeling like strangers. The boy had grown into a man Chester barely recognized, shaped by city living and corporate ambitions that might as well have been foreign languages. Danny worked in Denver now, something involving computers and endless meetings, married to a woman Chester had met exactly once at their hurried wedding ceremony 5 years ago. The last phone call had been Danny's birthday 3 months back, a stilted conversation where they'd both tried too hard to bridge a gap that seemed to widen with each passing year. Chester understood his son's choices, even respected them, but understanding and acceptance were different things. The mountains that had given Chester peace seemed to represent everything Danny wanted to escape. The irony wasn't lost on Chester that he'd once felt the same way about his own father's farm in Kansas, viewing those endless wheat fields as a prison rather than a heritage. It had taken a war and its aftermath to teach him the value of quiet places and simple work. Perhaps Danny would find his own way back eventually, or perhaps some lessons could only be learned through loss. Chester finished his coffee and walked to the woodshed, Scout trailing behind with the loyalty of long habit. The rhythm of splitting wood had become his morning meditation, the satisfying crack of the maul driving through seasoned pine, a sound that never failed to ground him in the present moment. Each swing carried the weight of purpose. Winter was coming, as it always did in these mountains, and preparation was the difference between comfort and survival. The pile of split logs grew steadily as the sun climbed higher, painting the aspens in shades of gold that would fade to brown within weeks. Chester's movements were economical, efficient, honed by decades of practice. His body showed the wear of 70 years, but mountain living had kept him strong. He could still pack an elk out of the backcountry, still hike 20 miles in a day when necessary, still handle whatever challenges the wilderness threw his way. His workshop occupied the cabin's lower level, a sanctuary of hand tools and half-finished projects that spoke to his need to create beauty from raw materials. Shelves lined the walls, filled with pieces he'd crafted over the years, bowls turned from burl wood, tables fitted with mortise and tenon joints that would outlast their maker, intricate carvings that captured the essence of mountain, wildlife in pine and aspen. Martha had been his best customer and harshest critic, never hesitating to point out when his impatience showed in sloppy work. The pieces he made now had no destination beyond his own satisfaction. Occasionally, folks from town would drive up the mountain road to commission a piece, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations from the few neighbors who'd seen his work. Chester charged fair prices and delivered on time, but he'd never been interested in turning his craft into a business. The work itself was the reward, the meditation of seeing potential in raw wood, the satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful with his own hands. Scout's sudden alertness broke Chester's contemplation. The dog stood rigid, ears forward, staring down the mountain road that wound through the pines toward their cabin. Chester set down his maul and listened, hearing nothing but wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk circling above the valley. "What is it, boy?" Chester asked, trusting the dog's superior senses. Scout had never been one for false alarms, and his current posture suggested something more significant than the usual parade of wildlife that shared their mountain home. The old hound's nose twitched as he sorted through the complex symphony of mountain scents, pine resin, decomposing leaves, the musk of deer that had passed in the night. But underneath these familiar smells, Scout detected something foreign, something that didn't belong to their ordered world of seasons and predictable rhythms. Chester walked to the edge of his property, where the cleared space around his cabin gave way to dense forest. The road below was empty, as it usually was this time of year, when the tourist season had ended and hunting season hadn't yet begun. But Scout remained alert, his tail low and still, a sign that whatever had caught his attention deserved serious consideration. The weather was changing too. Chester could feel it in the way the wind shifted, carrying the sharp promise of early snow from the peaks above. October storms were common enough, but this one felt different, more urgent, more substantial than the usual dusting that would melt off by afternoon. The barometric pressure was dropping fast, and the way the aspen's leaves turned silver in the gusting wind spoke of a significant weather event approaching. Chester had learned to read these signs during his years in special forces, when weather could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Later, as a mountain guide before Martha's illness, he'd honed that skill to an art form, keeping clients safe by staying ahead of nature's moods. Now, in retirement, weather watching had become another form of meditation, a way of staying connected to the natural world that had become his sanctuary. He walked back to the cabin, Scout following close behind, and checked his emergency supplies out of long habit. The generator had fuel, the pantry was well stocked, and his medical kit was current. Living this far from town required preparation for every contingency, from broken bones to extended power outages. Chester had learned these lessons the hard way during his first winters on the mountain, when inexperience had nearly cost him dearly. The satellite radio crackled with the morning weather report, confirming what Chester already knew: a major storm system was moving in from the west, bringing heavy snow and dangerous winds to elevations above 8,000 feet. His cabin sat at 9,500 feet, well within the warning zone. By evening, they'd likely be snowed in for several days, a prospect that didn't worry Chester in the least. He had everything he needed to wait out whatever nature decided to throw at them. Scout had settled on his favorite rug near the fireplace, but his ears remained pricked, tracking sounds beyond human perception. Chester respected the dog's instincts too much to ignore his continued alertness. Something was different about this day, something that had put his normally calm companion on edge. The morning passed quietly enough as Chester completed his routine preparations for the approaching storm. He secured loose items around the property, checked the cabin's storm shutters, and brought extra firewood to the covered porch. These tasks required no conscious thought. They'd become as automatic as breathing after 15 years of mountain living. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer and the wind began to pick up in earnest, Scout's restlessness increased. The old dog paced between the cabin and the edge of the property, pausing frequently to test the air with his sophisticated nose. Chester found himself checking the road more often than usual, though he couldn't have explained why. As evening approached and the first snowflakes began to fall, both man and dog maintained their vigil, sensing that this night would bring more than just another mountain storm. Change was coming to their quiet world, carried on the wind like snow, inevitable as the turning of seasons, profound as the shifting of the earth itself. Scout's worn leather collar caught the last rays of sunlight as he stood guard, faithful and alert, ready to protect the only family he'd ever known from whatever challenges the darkness might bring. The blizzard arrived with the fury of something personal, as if the mountain gods had decided to test every soul foolish enough to venture above the tree line. By midnight, what had begun as gentle snowfall had transformed into a howling tempest that rattled the cabin's windows and sent Scout pacing anxiously between his bed and the door. Chester woke to the sound of wind that seemed determined to tear his roof away board by board. The storm had intensified beyond anything the weather service had predicted, dumping snow at a rate that would challenge even his well-prepared homestead. He pulled on his wool pants and heavy boots, knowing that morning chores would require extra effort in conditions like these. Scout met him at the door, whining softly, not his usual eagerness for their morning routine, but something more urgent. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly agitated throughout the night, and now his body language spoke of genuine distress rather than mere weather anxiety. "Easy, boy," Chester murmured, pulling on his heavy coat and reaching for his wool cap. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." The wind nearly knocked him backward as he opened the door. Snow swirled in dense curtains that reduced visibility to mere yards, and the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees from the previous evening. This was the kind of storm that killed unprepared hikers, the kind that turned a simple walk into a life-or-death struggle against nature's indifference. Scout bounded into the storm with purpose, his dark form quickly disappearing into the white chaos. Chester followed, the flashlight beam barely penetrating the wall of falling snow. The dog was heading toward Eagle's Rest Ravine, a steep-sided gully that marked the eastern boundary of Chester's property, dangerous terrain even in good weather. 20 minutes of trudging through knee-deep drifts brought them to the ravine's edge, where Scout's urgent barking cut through the wind's howl. Chester's flashlight swept the area, searching for whatever had captured his companion's attention. At first, he saw nothing but snow-covered rocks and twisted pine branches bent low by the storm's fury. Then Scout's beam caught something that didn't belong, a splash of bright red against the white landscape. Chester's military training kicked in instantly, assessing and cataloguing details, even as he scrambled down the treacherous slope toward the anomaly. It was a woman, unconscious and half buried in snow that had already begun to cover her still form. Her expensive hiking gear stood out starkly against the wilderness-setting high-tech fabric in vibrant colors, equipment that cost more than most people earned in a month. One boot had come off during what must have been a tumbling fall, revealing a foot already showing the waxy white signs of severe frostbite. Chester dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers finding the pulse point at her neck. Weak but steady, she was alive, but hypothermia was well advanced. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her skin pale and cold to the touch. In these conditions, she had perhaps an hour before her body would begin shutting down vital functions. "Scout, stay," Chester commanded, though the dog had already positioned himself as a windbreak. Years of mountain rescue experience took over as Chester assessed her injuries with practiced efficiency. The ankle was definitely sprained, possibly fractured, and she showed signs of dehydration alongside the hypothermia. Her expensive gear had kept her alive this long, but it wouldn't be enough to save her. Chester shed his own coat and wrapped it around her still form, then began the delicate process of lifting her from the snow-filled depression where she'd fallen. She was smaller than Martha had been, but dead weight in deep snow made every step a monumental effort. Scout stayed close, his warm body helping to block the worst of the wind as they began the slow journey back to the cabin. The trip that had taken 20 minutes became an hour-long battle against the storm and Chester's own advancing age. His back screamed in protest as he carried her up the steep slope, but military discipline and mountain experience drove him forward. This was what decent people did. They saved lives when they could, regardless of the cost to themselves. By the time they reached the cabin, Chester's breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. But there was no time for rest. Hypothermia required immediate and aggressive treatment if the woman was going to survive. Chester carried her directly to the bedroom, laying her on Martha's side of the bed with an efficiency born of old training. He stripped away her wet clothing without ceremony, checking for additional injuries as he worked. The ankle was swollen and discolored, definitely sprained, but her other injuries appeared superficial cuts and bruises from her tumble into the ravine. Warming a hypothermia victim required careful technique. Too fast, and the returning blood flow could trigger cardiac arrest. Chester filled hot water bottles and placed them at her pulse points, wrists, neck, and ankles, while piling every blanket in the cabin over her still form. Scout took up position beside the bed, his body heat adding to the warming process. For the next several hours, Chester maintained his vigil, monitoring her breathing and pulse while gradually raising her core temperature. He'd performed this same procedure twice before, once for a fellow soldier in the mountains of Vietnam, once for a tourist who'd gotten lost during his guiding days. Both had survived, and he intended this woman to make it 3 for 3. As dawn broke grey and stormy outside, her breathing deepened and her color began to improve. She mumbled incoherently in her delirium, fragments of sentences that spoke of boardroom betrayals and hostile takeovers, language that seemed wildly out of place in his mountain sanctuary. "The votes aren't there," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "Marcus is lying. The Shanghai deal, they can't know about Shanghai. Chester listened with growing puzzlement. This wasn't the rambling of an ordinary hiker lost in the mountains. Her expensive gear, her corporate vocabulary, the fact that she'd been hiking alone in dangerous weather, none of it added up to a simple story of recreational misadventure. By afternoon, her fever had broken and her breathing had normalized. Chester allowed himself his first real rest since finding her, dozing in the bedside chair, while Scout maintained his protective watch. The storm continued to rage outside, ensuring that even if she recovered quickly, they'd be snowed in together for at least another day. When she finally opened her eyes, it was with the confused disorientation of someone waking in an unfamiliar place. Her gaze moved from Chester's weathered face to Scout's concerned expression, then around the rustic bedroom with its handmade furniture and simple decorations. "Where?" she began, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "You're safe," Chester said quietly, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "You had a bad fall up near Eagle's Rest Ravine. Hypothermia and some dehydration, but you're going to be fine." She tried to sit up, wincing as her injured ankle reminded her of her ordeal. Chester gently pressed her back down, noting the intelligence in her eyes as she processed her situation. "I need to—" she started, then stopped, some internal caution taking over. "How long was I out?" "There? Can't say for certain," Chester replied. "Scout found you during the worst of last night's storm. You've been unconscious for about 18 hours. He brought her water and helped her drink slowly, watching as she struggled to remember the events that had brought her to his mountain. Her expensive hiking boot sat in the corner where he'd placed it after cutting it off her swollen foot, a tangible reminder of how close she'd come to dying alone in the wilderness. "What's your name?" Chester asked gently. She hesitated, and in that pause, Chester recognized the look of someone deciding how much truth to share with a stranger. "Catherine," she said finally. Catherine Vale. The name meant nothing to Chester, but the way she said it carefully, as if testing its weight, suggested it should have. Scout settled himself beside the bed, his instincts apparently satisfied that this stranger posed no threat to their small mountain family. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their sanctuary, but inside the cabin, warmth and safety prevailed. Chester had saved another life, though he suspected this rescue would prove more complicated than his previous ones. This woman carried secrets as surely as she'd carried that expensive gear, and secrets had a way of following people even into the most remote wilderness. As Catherine drifted back into healing sleep, Chester wondered what forces had driven her to his mountain in the middle of an October blizzard. Whatever her story, she was his responsibility now, at least until the storm passed and she could safely leave. He'd learned long ago that some burdens chose you rather than the other way around. Scout's steady breathing and the woman's peaceful rest filled the cabin with a quiet that felt different from Chester's usual solitude. Change had arrived on the mountain, carried by wind and snow, and a mysterious stranger who spoke of corporate betrayals in her delirium. The question now was whether that change would prove to be blessing or curse for an old man who'd grown comfortable with his chosen isolation. Catherine woke to the gentle sound of wood crackling in a fireplace and the unfamiliar sensation of genuine warmth penetrating her bones. For a moment, she lay still with her eyes closed, trying to piece together fragments of memory that felt more like dreams than reality. The corporate boardroom, the hiking trail, the growing certainty that she was being followed, all of it seemed to belong to someone else's life. The bedroom around her spoke of careful craftsmanship and patient love. Hand-hewn log walls bore the marks of their maker's tools, and morning light filtered through windows that had been positioned to capture the mountain's first rays. A simple wooden chair sat beside the bed, its seat worn smooth by years of use, and she realized with a start that the weathered man who'd saved her life must have spent the night watching over her recovery. "You're awake," came a quiet voice from the doorway. Chester stood there holding a steaming mug, his silver hair still showing pillow marks despite the advanced hour. "How are you feeling?" Catherine attempted to sit up, immediately regretting the movement as her injured ankle sent sharp protests up her leg. "Sore," she admitted, accepting the mug he offered. The coffee was strong and black, exactly what her dehydrated system craved. "But alive, thanks to you." Scout appeared beside Chester, tail wagging tentatively as he assessed this stranger who disrupted their quiet routine. The old dog's intelligent eyes seemed to take her measure, and Catherine found herself hoping for his approval in a way that surprised her. "This is Scout," Chester said, noticing her attention to his companion. "He's the one who found you. Without him, you'd still be buried in that ravine." Catherine extended her hand toward the dog, letting him catch her scent before attempting contact. Scout's approach was cautious but friendly, and when he finally allowed her to scratch behind his ears, she felt an unexpected surge of emotion. When had she last touched another living creature with such simple affection? "I owe you both my life," she said quietly. "I don't remember much about yesterday, but I know I was in serious trouble out there." Chester settled into the bedside chair, his movements carrying the careful economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. The storm came in harder and faster than anyone predicted. Even experienced hikers get caught off guard by weather like that. Catherine studied his weathered face, noting the laugh lines around his eyes and the way his hands showed the calluses of honest work. This man was nothing like the people who dominated her usual world. No hidden agendas, no calculated responses, just straightforward kindness offered without expectation of reward. "Were you hiking alone?" Chester asked gently, his tone carrying no judgment. The question brought back flashes of her panicked flight from the corporate retreat, the growing certainty that someone in her inner circle was orchestrating her downfall. How could she explain that she'd fled into the wilderness because it felt safer than remaining among people she'd trusted for years? "Yes," she said simply, unwilling to elaborate. "I needed some time to think." Chester nodded, as if solitary hiking for the purpose of contemplation was the most natural thing in the world. In his mountain sanctuary, perhaps it was. "Well, you'll have plenty of time for thinking while that ankle heals. Storms passed, but the roads won't be clear for a few days yet." The prospect of being stranded should have triggered her usual need for immediate action and constant connectivity. Instead, Catherine found herself feeling something she couldn't immediately identify: relief. For the first time in months, she was genuinely unreachable, genuinely safe from the machinations that had consumed her life. "I don't want to impose," she began, but Chester waved away her concern. "No imposition. I've got supplies for the winter, and Scout enjoys the company. Been just the two of us up here for a long time." Something in his tone suggested that solitude hadn't always been his chosen state. Catherine sensed layers of loss in this man, grief that had been carefully contained but never fully healed. She recognized the signs because she carried her own collection of professional disappointments and personal failures. Over the next 2 days, as Catherine's strength gradually returned, she began to appreciate the intricate rhythms of Chester's mountain life. He woke before dawn, checked the weather with the practiced eye of someone whose survival depended on reading nature's moods correctly. His morning routine included feeding Scout, stoking the fire, and brewing coffee that could wake the dead. Chester had fashioned a simple wooden spoon specifically for feeding her during the first critical hours of her recovery, carving it from a piece of pine while she slept. The utensil was perfectly balanced, smooth to the touch, created with the kind of care that spoke of a man who found meaning in small acts of service. "You made this for me?" Catherine asked, turning the spoon over in her hands and marveling at its craftsmanship. "Seemed easier than trying to get soup into you with a regular spoon while you were barely conscious." Chester replied with characteristic understatement. "Pine's soft enough to work quickly, and it won't hurt your mouth if your hands shake." The thoughtfulness behind such a simple gesture moved Catherine more than any expensive gift she'd ever received. In her world, people demonstrated care through grand gestures and public displays, but Chester's kindness was quiet, practical, and deeply personal. As her physical strength returned, Catherine attempted to help with simple tasks around the cabin. Her first effort at splitting kindling resulted in more scattered wood than properly sized pieces, but Chester's patient instruction gradually improved her technique. The work felt foreign to hands, accustomed to keyboards and touchscreens, yet satisfying in ways she couldn't articulate. "The wood tells you where it wants to split," Chester explained, demonstrating the proper stance and swing. "You're not fighting it, you're helping it become what it's meant to be." Catherine found unexpected philosophy in this practical instruction. How long had she been fighting against natural inclinations, forcing outcomes that served corporate interests rather than human needs? The metaphor resonated more deeply than Chester could have known. Scout proved to be an excellent intermediary between the two humans, his obvious contentment with their arrangement helping to ease any awkwardness. The dog divided his attention equally between them, following Chester during outdoor chores and settling beside Catherine when she rested by the fire. His acceptance of her presence seemed to give Chester permission to relax his natural caution around strangers. Evening conversations by the fireplace revealed glimpses of Chester's history without him volunteering details. References to the service suggested military experience, while mentions of Martha in past tense spoke of love and loss. Catherine shared equally careful details about her own life, her work in technology, her residence in San Francisco, her preference for mountains over beaches. Neither pressed the other for specifics, creating a comfortable space where two people could heal without the burden of complete honesty. Catherine found herself sleeping more deeply than she had in years, lulled by the mountain's silence and the knowledge that she was truly safe for the first time in months. On her third morning in the cabin, Catherine woke to find Chester and Scout already gone on some errand. She made her way carefully to the kitchen, her ankle finally strong enough to bear weight without assistance. The simple act of preparing her own coffee felt like a small victory, a return to independence she'd feared might be permanently compromised. Through the window, she watched Chester emerge from the tree line, carrying an armload of pine boughs, Scout trotting alongside, with obvious satisfaction at their successful foraging expedition. The sight of them together, man and dog, moving in perfect harmony with their environment, filled Catherine with an emotion she couldn't name. For the first time in her adult life, she found herself wondering what it would be like to belong to a place rather than simply owning property within it. Chester had built something here that went beyond mere survival. He'd created a life that honored both solitude and connection, independence and interdependence. As they returned to the cabin, Scout's tail wagging with simple joy at another successful morning, Catherine realized that her rescue had become something more complex than she'd initially understood. Chester had saved her life, but perhaps, more importantly, he was showing her a way of living she'd never imagined possible. The nightmares came without warning on Catherine's fourth night in the cabin. Chester woke to the sound of distressed murmuring from the bedroom, words that spoke of betrayal and calculated destruction, delivered in the fractured syntax of sleep terror. He found her thrashing beneath Martha's old quilt, her face contorted with the kind of anguish that came from wounds deeper than any physical injury. "The board meeting," she whispered urgently, her eyes still closed. "Marcus knows about the Shanghai accounts. He's going to destroy everything we built." Chester approached slowly, speaking in the same calm tones he'd use with a spooked horse. "Catherine, you're safe. You're in the mountains, remember? No boardrooms here, just pine trees and morning coffee." Her eyes snapped open, wild with confusion, until she recognized his weathered face in the lamplight. The transition from corporate nightmare to mountain sanctuary left her shaking, and Chester noticed how her hands trembled as she pushed tangled hair away from her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to wake you." "No need for apologies," Chester replied, settling into the bedside chair he'd occupied during her initial recovery. We all carry things that follow us into sleep. Would you like to talk about it? The offer hung in the air between them, gentle, but without pressure. Catherine studied his face, seeing genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. In her world, vulnerability was currency that bought temporary alliances, but Chester seemed to offer understanding without expecting payment. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Work stuff, people I trusted." She stopped, unwilling to voice the full extent of her suspicions. Chester nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that betrayal wore many faces. "In my experience, the people closest to us have the most power to hurt us. That's the price of trust." His words carried the weight of personal knowledge, and Catherine sensed that this man had faced his own betrayals. The observation was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggested she wasn't alone in her experience. Unsettling because it reminded her that even mountain sanctuaries couldn't erase the past entirely. Scout had appeared during their conversation, padding silently to Catherine's side of the bed. The old dog's presence was calming, his steady breathing and warm body providing an anchor to the present moment. Catherine found herself grateful for his intuitive understanding of human distress. "Tell me about Martha," Catherine said, partly to change the subject and partly because she'd noticed the care with which Chester maintained traces of another presence in the cabin. "She lived here with you?" Chester's expression softened with memory, the kind of look that spoke of love that had weathered all seasons. 37 years of marriage, the last 15 up here on the mountain. "She was the one who convinced me to leave the city," said a man needed space to hear his own thoughts. He rose and walked to the dresser, returning with a small wooden box that had been worn smooth by countless handlings. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay a simple gold wedding band. Martha's ring, Catherine realized, kept close even 15 years after her passing. "Cancer took her in the spring of 2009, Chester continued, his voice steady but soft. "She fought it for 2 years, never complained once about the pain or the treatments that required driving down to Denver. Said the mountain air made everything bearable." Catherine watched him handle the ring with reverent care, understanding that this small circle of gold represented more than just marriage. It was the physical reminder of a partnership that had shaped every corner of his current life. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Starting over somewhere without so many memories?" Chester considered the question seriously, turning the ring over in his weathered fingers. "Can't say I haven't thought about it, especially during the first few years. But running from memories doesn't make them disappear, it just makes you a stranger to yourself." The wisdom in his words struck Catherine with unexpected force. Hadn't she been running from her own painful realities when she'd fled into the mountains? The corporate betrayals, the isolation that came with wielding power, the growing realization that success had cost her more than she'd been willing to acknowledge. "My son thinks I should move to town," Chester continued. "Danny lives down in Denver, works with computers. He comes by maybe twice a year, usually trying to convince me I'm too old to live up here alone. What do you think?" Catherine asked. Chester smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. This mountain has been good to me. Taught me things I couldn't learn anywhere else. Scout here agrees with me. Don't you, boy?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, and Catherine found herself smiling despite the lingering echoes of her nightmare. There was something deeply appealing about Chester's certainty, his rootedness in place and purpose. Over the following days, their conversations grew more honest and substantial. Catherine learned that Chester had served in Vietnam as a young man, though he spoke little about the experience, except to say it had taught him the value of quiet places. She shared her own struggles with the isolation that came with corporate leadership, the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships when every interaction carried the weight of business implications. Chester showed her his workshop in the country, sir, cabin's lower level, a space that spoke of decades spent creating beauty from raw materials. Hand tools hung in careful arrangement on the walls, and half-finished projects occupied various workbenches, a rocking chair taking shape from seasoned oak, delicate carvings that captured the essence of mountain wildlife in pine and aspen. Martha used to say, "I carved my feelings into the wood," Chester explained, running his hand along the smooth curve of a wooden bowl. "Claimed she could tell my mood by the pieces I finished each week." Catherine picked up a small carving of a mountain lion, marveling at the detail Chester had achieved with simple hand tools. The piece seemed to capture not just the animal's physical form, but its essence power, held in careful check, wildness tempered by intelligence. "This is extraordinary," she said, meaning it. "You could sell work like this for serious money." Chester's laugh was gentle but dismissive. "Money's never been the point. I make what needs making, fix what needs fixing. The work itself is the reward." The concept was foreign to Catherine's achievement-oriented worldview, yet she found herself envying Chester's ability to find fulfillment in process rather than profit. When had she last created something purely for the joy of creation? That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple dinner of venison stew and fresh bread, Catherine realized that her ankle had healed enough for travel. The roads were clear, and she could return to her San Francisco life whenever she chose. The knowledge should have brought relief, but instead it filled her with an unexpected reluctance to leave this sanctuary. "Chester," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something about why I was hiking alone in that storm." He set down his coffee cup and gave her his full attention, the same patient focus he'd shown throughout her recovery. Scout raised his head from his position by the fire, as if sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. "I wasn't just hiking for recreation," Catherine continued. "I was running from something, people who want to destroy everything I've worked to build. I think someone I trusted is trying to have me killed." The words hung in the air between them, stark and serious in the firelight. Chester's expression didn't change, but Catherine saw his posture shift slightly, military alertness replacing casual attention. "Well then," Chester said quietly, his voice carrying new resolve, "I guess we'd better make sure they don't succeed." The satellite phone appeared among Catherine's scattered belongings like an accusation, its sleek black surface gleaming against the rustic wooden table where Chester had placed her recovered gear. He'd spent the morning hiking back to Eagle's Rest Ravine, retrieving items that had been scattered during her fall. And now, the expensive equipment spread before them told a story that contradicted everything she'd shared about her. Simple hiking excursion, high-end GPS device, emergency beacon, satellite communicator. Chester enumerated quietly, his military training evident in the methodical way he catalogued each item. "This isn't gear for a casual day hike, Catherine. This is equipment for someone who expected to be hunted." Catherine stared at the satellite phone with an expression that mixed fear and resignation. The device represented her connection to a world that felt increasingly dangerous, a lifeline that might also serve as a tracking beacon for those who wished her harm. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, and Chester noticed how she hesitated before making contact. "The phone has GPS tracking," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I turn it on, they'll know exactly where I am within minutes." Chester's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes sharpened with the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive through decades of military service and mountain living. "Who's they, Catherine? And why do they want to find you badly enough to drive you into a blizzard?" The question hung between them like smoke from the fireplace, heavy with implications that would fundamentally change their relationship. Catherine understood that her answer would transform Chester from rescuer to potential target, but she also sensed that this man possessed resources and capabilities she desperately needed. "I'm the CEO of Veilcore Technologies," she said finally, each word feeling like a stone dropping into still water. "We're worth about $40 billion, and someone very close to me is orchestrating a hostile takeover that would destroy everything I've built." Chester's expression didn't change, though Scout raised his head from his position by the fire, perhaps sensing the tension that suddenly filled the room. The name Veilcore meant nothing to Chester. Technology companies existed in a world as foreign to him as his mountain. Sanctuary was to Catherine, but he understood betrayal, and he recognized genuine fear. The hiking trip was cover, Catherine continued, her words coming faster now that the truth had begun flowing. I discovered that my business partner, Marcus Webb, has been feeding information to our competitors while systematically undermining my authority with the board of directors. The Shanghai accounts she mentioned in her nightmares. Marcus had been siphoning funds through shell companies, setting up a financial crisis that would justify my removal. Chester absorbed this information with the patience of someone accustomed to processing complex tactical situations. In Vietnam, understanding the enemy's motivations had been crucial to survival, and he applied the same analytical approach to Catherine's corporate warfare. "So you ran," he observed without judgment. "I ran because I realized the hiking retreat wasn't just about getting me away from the office," Catherine replied, her voice gaining strength. Marcus suggested the location, arranged the guide, even recommended the specific trail. When the guide didn't show up, and I found tracking devices hidden in my gear, I knew the whole thing was a setup. The implications were chilling. If Catherine's suspicions were correct, her rescue by Chester hadn't been the end of her ordeal. It had merely delayed whatever Marcus had planned for her in the wilderness. The thought of someone using the mountains as a killing ground stirred something protective and angry in Chester's chest. "You think they're still looking for you?" he asked. Catherine nodded toward the satellite phone. "Marcus will have reported me missing by now, probably with some story about how I wandered off the trail against his advice. Search and rescue teams will be out there, but so will his people. The question is, who finds me first?" Chester stood and walked to the window, studying the mountain landscape with new eyes. What had been his peaceful sanctuary now required assessment as a potential battlefield. The cabin's location offered tactical advantages: high ground, excellent sight lines, limited approaches, but it also represented isolation that could work against them if superior numbers were brought to bear. "Why should I believe you?" Chester asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already did. "Corporate executive shows up in my mountains with expensive gear and stories about assassination attempts. Sounds like something from a movie." Catherine pulled up her sleeve, revealing a small bandage on her forearm. Beneath it, Chester could see the edges of what appeared to be a surgical incision, still pink with recent healing. "3 weeks ago, someone tried to poison me at a board dinner," she said. "The doctors found traces of ricin in my blood, but the dose was carefully calculated enough to make me sick, not enough to kill immediately. Marcus was very concerned about my health, suggested I needed time away from the stress of running the company. The evidence was compelling, but Chester found himself believing Catherine for reasons that went beyond physical proof. During their conversations over the past few days, he'd observed her character, her genuine reactions to mountain life, her obvious unfamiliarity with deception on a personal level. She might be skilled at corporate maneuvering, but she lacked the practiced ease of someone accustomed to lying about matters of life and death. $40 billion, Chester mused, finally understanding the scale of what was at stake. That's the kind of money that makes people do terrible things. Marcus stands to make about $8 billion if the takeover succeeds, Catherine confirmed. He's been planning this for years, positioning himself as my logical successor while systematically undermining my relationships with key board members. Scout's sudden alertness interrupted their conversation. The old dog stood at attention, his ears pricked towards sounds beyond human perception. Chester instantly shifted into tactical mode, moving to the window and scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. "We've got company," he announced quietly, his military training evident in the calm authority of his voice. "Scout's never wrong about intruders." Catherine's face went pale as she processed the implications. "How did they find us?" Chester pointed to her expensive hiking gear. Your equipment might have tracking devices beyond the obvious ones. Or they're doing grid searches of the area where you disappeared. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew what appeared to be military-issue binoculars. Either way, your vacation's over. Through the binoculars, Chester could make out movement in the tree line below the cabin, at least 3 figures, moving with the kind of coordination that suggested professional training rather than casual search and rescue operations. They wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with military bearing, and their equipment was too sophisticated for volunteer searchers. "They found us," Chester confirmed, his voice carrying the deadly calm of someone preparing for combat. "Question now is whether we run or make a stand." Catherine stared at the satellite phone, understanding that its presence had likely sealed their fate. The device that could have summoned help had instead served as a beacon for those who wished her harm. Her corporate world had finally invaded Chester's mountain sanctuary, bringing violence to a place that had known only peace. "I won't run anymore," she said with quiet determination. "And I won't let them hurt you because of me." Chester turned from the window, and Catherine saw something new in his weathered features, not the gentle mountain man who'd saved her life, but the ghost of a warrior who'd learned to fight on terms that favored survival over sentiment. "Well then," Chester said, his voice carrying an edge that spoke of old skills. "Awakening. I guess it's time they learned that some mountains bite back." The handwritten recipe book lay open on the kitchen table between them, Martha's careful script detailing her famous venison stew, alongside notes about which herbs grew best in mountain soil. Chester had brought it out while they waited for full darkness, sharing stories of his late wife's cooking while teaching Catherine the practical skills that might keep them both alive. "Martha always said the secret was in the patience," Chester explained, his weathered fingers tracing the faded ink. "Low heat, long cooking, letting the flavors find their own harmony. Same principle applies to most things worth doing." Catherine studied the recipe with genuine interest, though part of her attention remained focused on the tactical preparations Chester had been making throughout the afternoon. He'd moved through the cabin with military efficiency, checking weapons, securing potential entry points, and positioning supplies with the kind of methodical planning that spoke of hard-earned experience. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Catherine said, noting how Martha had included little observations, alongside cooking instructions, reminders about Chester's preferences, notes about which neighbors might appreciate a shared meal, and gentle wisdom about making a house into a home. "She was the kind of person who made everyone around her better," Chester replied, carefully closing the book and setting it aside. "Took me 30 years to understand that the best partnerships aren't about finding someone who completes you. They're about finding someone who helps you become who you're supposed to be." The observation carried weight beyond its immediate context, and Catherine found herself wondering what kind of partnership she might have built with someone like Chester under different circumstances. Her corporate relationships had always been transactional, built on mutual benefit rather than mutual growth, and she was beginning to understand the difference. "Tell me about Veilcore," Chester said, settling into his chair with the patient attention he brought to all important conversations. "What exactly does your company do?" Catherine appreciated his directness. Most people either knew too much about her business empire or pretended ignorance while calculating how her wealth might benefit them. Chester's genuine curiosity was refreshing, even under their current circumstances. "We develop artificial intelligence systems for medical diagnostics," she explained. "Our algorithms can detect cancer, predict heart disease, analyze genetic markers for inherited conditions. The technology has helped save thousands of lives, and it's made us very wealthy in the process." Chester nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like important work. Why would your partner want to destroy something that helps people?" "Because helping people was never Marcus's primary motivation," Catherine replied, feeling the familiar anger that came with thinking about her partner's betrayal. "He saw Veilcore as a stepping stone to bigger things, defense contracts, government surveillance systems, applications that prioritize profit over human welfare. The distinction clearly resonated with Chester, whose military background had given him first-hand experience with the difference between serving others and serving interests. His expression suggested both understanding and disgust at the corruption of something genuinely beneficial. The Shanghai accounts Marcus mentioned in my delirium, Catherine continued. He's been channeling company funds to develop military applications of our medical AI. Facial recognition systems, behavioral prediction algorithms, tools that could be used to identify and track dissidents in authoritarian regimes. Chester's jaw tightened with the kind of controlled anger that spoke of personal experience with the abuse of power. So he's not just stealing your company, he's planning to turn your life's work into something that hurts people. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. And killing me is the cleanest way to clear his path. As long as I'm alive, I can expose what he's been doing, rally support among board members who still believe in our original mission. Dead, I become a tragic victim of hiking accident, and Marcus steps into leadership with appropriate grief and determination to honor my memory. The tactical analysis was sound, Chester had to admit. In warfare, eliminating opposing leadership was often the most efficient path to victory, and corporate warfare apparently followed similar principles. What troubled him was the cold calculation required to plan the murder of someone who'd trusted you completely. Outside, Scout's occasional movement on the porch confirmed that their uninvited guests remained in position, apparently content to wait for better conditions before making their approach. Chester's military experience suggested they were waiting for full darkness, when superior numbers and professional training would give them maximum advantage. I need to understand something, Catherine said carefully. When you said some mountains bite back, what exactly did you mean? Chester was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the kind of assessment that preceded important decisions. Finally, he rose and walked to a cabinet that Catherine hadn't seen him open before. Inside, carefully maintained and obviously functional, lay equipment that spoke of capabilities she'd only begun to suspect. Served 3 tours in Vietnam, Chester said simply, lifting out what appeared to be night vision goggles and a tactical knife that had seen considerable use. Special forces, reconnaissance, and asymmetric warfare. Spent 2 years after the war training mountain rescue teams in Colorado before I met Martha and decided to settle down. The revelation recontextualized everything Catherine thought she knew about her rescuer. The patient mountain man who'd saved her life was also a trained killer, someone who'd learned to survive in hostile territory by turning environmental advantages into tactical superiority. Scout's not just a pet either, Chester continued, scratching behind the dog's ears. He's a retired military working dog, trained in explosive detection and tactical support. We found each other at a veterans rehabilitation center about 12 years ago, 2 old soldiers learning to live with peace. Catherine stared at the weaponry Chester had revealed, understanding that her presence had awakened something in this man that he'd deliberately put to rest. The quiet mountain sanctuary wasn't just a retreat from the world, it was a careful construct designed to contain capabilities that had once been necessary for survival. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to your home." "You didn't bring the trouble," Chester replied, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from years of tactical assessment. "You brought yourself, and you trusted me with the truth when you could have kept lying. The trouble followed you here, but it's not your fault that some people can't leave well enough alone." He moved to the window and checked the approaching darkness, his movements taking on the fluid efficiency of someone preparing for combat. Scout joined him, the old dog's posture shifting from relaxed companion to alert sentry. "Here's what's going to happen," Chester said, his tone carrying military authority that brooked no argument. "Those men down there think they're dealing with an isolated CEO and an old mountain hermit. They're counting on superior numbers, professional training, and the element of surprise. Catherine watched him check his equipment with practiced hands, understanding that she was witnessing a transformation from peaceful retiree to active combatant. The change was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it suggested they might actually survive the night. Terrifying because it reminded her of the violence her corporate problems had unleashed. What they don't know, Chester continued, is that this mountain has been home to a couple of old soldiers for 15 years, and we've had plenty of time to prepare for uninvited guests. Scout and I might be retired, but we never forgot how to defend what matters to us. He turned from the window and met Catherine's eyes with steady resolve. Question is, are you ready to fight for your life, or are you planning to let them win? Catherine thought about Marcus's betrayal, about the life's work he intended to corrupt, about the thousands of patients whose lives depended on keeping Veilcore's technology in ethical hands. She thought about Chester's quiet kindness and the peace she'd found in his mountain sanctuary. "I'm ready," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Tell me what I need to do." The private investigator's business card lay face down on the kitchen table, where Catherine had found it, placed with deliberate precision next to her morning coffee cup. Someone had been inside the cabin while they slept, moving through Chester's carefully secured sanctuary like a ghost, leaving behind a calling card that spoke of capabilities far beyond anything they'd prepared for. Catherine's hands trembled as she turned the card over, reading the embossed text that confirmed her worst fears. Blackwater Security Solutions, it read, with a Denver address and a name she recognized from Marcus's corporate connections. This wasn't a search and rescue operation, or even a simple assassination attempt. This was a message from someone who wanted her to understand exactly how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. "Chester," she called, her voice tight with controlled panic. "You need to see this." He emerged from the bedroom already dressed and alert, Scout padding alongside with the heightened awareness that came from sensing his human's elevated stress. Chester's eyes went immediately to the card, then swept the cabin with tactical precision, cataloguing every detail that might have been disturbed during the night. "Impossible," he muttered, checking the door locks and window latches that should have detected any intrusion. "Scout would have woken us if anyone came close to the cabin." Catherine studied the card more carefully, noting details that chilled her blood. The paper was expensive, the kind of high-quality cardstock that spoke of serious money and professional operations. But it was the handwritten note on the back that stopped her breathing entirely. "Looking forward to our reunion, Catherine. Your hiking accident has been postponed indefinitely. M.W." Marcus Webb's distinctive handwriting transformed the business card from a threat into a revelation. Her business partner wasn't orchestrating this operation from the safety of San Francisco. He was here, on Chester's Mountain, directing the hunt personally. "He's here," Catherine whispered, the full implications crashing over her like an avalanche. "Marcus is actually here, running this operation himself." Chester's expression shifted from confusion to grim understanding as he processed what this meant for their tactical situation. If Marcus was present, it suggested resources and planning far beyond what they'd anticipated. Corporate executives didn't personally oversee assassination attempts unless the stakes were enormous and the timeline was critical. "There's something else," Catherine continued, her voice barely audible. "The hiking trip wasn't just a setup for an accident. Marcus needed me isolated and away from corporate security, but he also needed something that only I could provide." She moved to her recovered gear and withdrew a small device that looked like an ordinary flash drive. Chester recognized it as some kind of computer storage, though its specific purpose remained mysterious to someone whose technical expertise ended with satellite radios and GPS units. "This contains the master encryption keys for all of Veilcore's research databases," Catherine explained. "Without these keys, our AI algorithms are worthless, just scrambled data that would take decades to decode. Marcus can steal the company, but he can't access our core technology without this device." The revelation recontextualized everything they thought they understood about their situation. Marcus hadn't just been planning Catherine's death. He'd been orchestrating an elaborate scheme to force her into a position where she'd have the encryption keys with her, away from corporate security systems that would normally protect such valuable intellectual property. So the hiking trip, Chester said slowly, working through the tactical implications, was designed to get you alone with the one thing he needed most. Exactly. Marcus convinced me to bring the keys as a security precaution, said I should have access to our systems in case of emergency while I was away from the office. I thought I was being responsible. I was actually walking into a trap that's been months in the making. Chester's military mind raced through the possibilities, understanding that they were facing an enemy who demonstrated superior intelligence, unlimited resources, and the kind of long-term planning that suggested professional military or intelligence backgrounds. The fact that someone had penetrated his cabin without triggering any of his early warning systems spoke of capabilities that went far beyond corporate muscle. You Manning 18, King Martin, we need to assume they know everything about our situation, Chester said, his voice carrying the deadly calm of someone preparing for asymmetric warfare. Location, capabilities, probably even our conversation patterns. They've been watching us, learning our routines, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Catherine stared at the encryption device, understanding that it represented both her death warrant and possibly their only bargaining chip. What I don't understand is why they haven't just taken it. They've obviously been close enough to enter the cabin. Why leave a calling card instead of completing their mission? The answer came to Chester with the clarity of tactical experience. Because they want you alive when they take it. Dead woman can't provide passwords, can't verify that the encryption keys are authentic, can't be coerced into revealing whatever additional security measures might be protecting the data. The implication was chilling. Marcus's plan required Catherine's cooperation, which meant torture, intimidation, and psychological pressure designed to break her resistance. The hiking accident had been replaced by something far more sophisticated and infinitely more cruel. Scout's sudden movement toward the window interrupted their analysis. The old dog's posture spoke of immediate threat, his training taking over as he positioned himself between his humans and whatever danger approached from outside. Chester joined him at the window, using the early morning light to scan the tree line below. 2 vehicles on the access road, Chester reported quietly. Professional drivers, coordinated approach. They're not hiding anymore. They want us to know they're coming. Catherine moved to join them, her stomach tightening as she recognized one of the figures emerging from the lead vehicle. Marcus Webb looked exactly as she remembered, tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed even in outdoor gear. But there was something different about his posture, a confidence that spoke of holding all the advantages in whatever game they'd been playing. "How many men?" Catherine asked, trying to count the figures spreading out around the cabin's perimeter. "At least 8 that I can see," Chester replied, his military experience evident in the speed and accuracy of his tactical assessment. Professional spacing, covering all approaches. They're not planning to negotiate. Catherine watched Marcus position himself where she could clearly see him from the window, understanding that even this moment was calculated for psychological effect. He wanted her to know that her oldest friend and business partner was personally overseeing her destruction. "There's something else you need to know," Catherine said quietly, the weight of a final secret almost too heavy to bear. "Marcus isn't just my business partner. He's Danny's father." Chester's head snapped toward her, his weathered face showing shock that quickly transformed into something much more dangerous. "What did you say?" "Your son, Danny. Marcus Webb is his biological father. They've been in contact for years, ever since Danny moved to Denver. Marcus has been using that relationship to gather information about you, about this place, about your capabilities and weaknesses." The revelation hit Chester like a physical blow, recontextualizing his son's distant behavior, the awkward visits, the growing sense that Danny was becoming a stranger. His own child had been feeding information to the man who was now threatening to destroy the one person who'd brought meaning back to Chester's life. "Danny doesn't know what Marcus is planning," Catherine continued quickly, seeing the pain and fury warring in Chester's expression. "Marcus told him he was concerned about my mental state, that he was planning an intervention to get me help. Danny thinks he's helping save his father from a dangerous woman." Chester absorbed this information with the kind of control that came from decades of processing betrayal and loss. But Catherine could see something fundamental shifting in his weathered features, the transformation from protective mountain man to someone who'd learned to survive by eliminating threats to everything he held sacred. "So my son helped them find us," Chester said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Scout's ears flatten against his head. "And now they're here to take the one good thing that's happened to me in 15 years. Outside, Marcus raised his hand in a casual wave, as if greeting old friends rather than preparing to destroy lives. The gesture was calculated to demonstrate his complete confidence in the outcome of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "They want the encryption keys," Catherine said, "but they also want to break us completely. Marcus knows that killing me isn't enough. He wants to destroy any possibility that someone might continue our work, might expose what he's planning to do with our technology." Chester's tactical mind was already working through options, but the personal betrayal had added a layer of cold fury that made this about far more than simple survival. His son's involvement transformed this from a rescue operation into something that would define the rest of his life. "Well then," Chester said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly quiet that preceded storms, "I guess it's time Marcus learned that some mistakes can't be undone, and some old soldiers never really retire." The battle for Catherine's life was about to begin, but Chester understood that the real war was for something far more precious, the right to choose how their story would end. Chester's combat knife lay on the kitchen table between them, its Vietnam-era blade reflecting the morning light that streamed through windows that might soon become firing positions. The weapon was simple, functional, marked by decades of use and careful maintenance. A tool that had saved Chester's life more times than he cared to remember, now brought out of retirement to defend the woman who'd unexpectedly become his reason for living. "The knife goes back to 1968, Chester said quietly, his weathered hands moving over the familiar grip with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. "Carried it through 3 tours, used it to save my life and take others when necessary. Never thought I'd need it again after I came to this mountain." Catherine studied the weapon with new understanding, recognizing that Chester's transformation from peaceful hermit to tactical combatant was complete. The man who'd gently carved a wooden spoon for her recovery was the same person who'd learned to kill efficiently in Southeast Asian jungles, and both aspects of his character would be necessary for their survival. Through her laptop computer, hastily connected to Chester's satellite internet, Catherine had spent the pre-dawn hours gathering intelligence on their enemies. Marcus's corporate security team wasn't just expensive muscle. They were former military contractors with experience in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, professionals who'd learned urban warfare and adapted those skills to corporate espionage and executive protection. 8 confirmed personnel, Catherine reported, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed databases that should have been beyond civilian reach. Team leader named Harrison Beck, former Navy SEAL with extensive private security experience. The others are a mix of special forces and Marine reconnaissance veterans. Chester absorbed this information with tactical appreciation rather than intimidation. In Vietnam, he'd learned that superior numbers and training meant nothing if the enemy didn't understand the terrain or underestimated their opposition's capabilities. "They're good," Chester acknowledged, "but they're thinking like urban operators, trying to adapt to wilderness conditions. This mountain has been my home for 15 years. Every trail, every hiding spot, every tactical advantage. They might have better equipment, but I know things they can't learn from satellite photos. Scout padded between them, his military training evident in the way he responded to the changed atmosphere in the cabin. The old dog's posture spoke of readiness, intelligence gathering, and protective instincts that had been honed through years of combat operations before his retirement to mountain life. Catherine's reconnaissance had revealed disturbing details about Marcus's long-term planning. Financial records showed payments to Blackwater Security Solutions going back 18 months, coinciding with his first attempts to undermine her authority at Valecore. Danny's relationship with Marcus included regular meetings, expensive gifts, and what appeared to be systematic debriefing sessions about his father's capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities. Marcus has been planning this for almost 2 years, Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Every board meeting, every strategic decision, every conversation we had about the future of the company, he was already working to destroy me. Chester's military experience had taught him that the most dangerous enemies were those who combined patience with ruthlessness, and Marcus appeared to possess both qualities in abundance. The fact that he'd recruited Chester's own son as an unwitting intelligence asset spoke of a mind that understood psychological warfare as well as corporate maneuvering. "What's the timeline?" Chester asked, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. "How long before they make their move?" Catherine consulted her laptop again, accessing communications intercepts that her corporate security clearances still allowed her to monitor. Marcus is under pressure from his financial backers. The hostile takeover attempt has a narrow window if he doesn't deliver the encryption keys within 48 hours. His partners will withdraw their support and find someone else to front their operation. The tactical picture was becoming clearer. Marcus needed Catherine alive long enough to extract the encryption keys and any additional security information that might be protecting Valecore's databases, but he also needed to eliminate any witnesses who could expose his methods or challenge his claim to have inherited the company after Catherine's tragic death. "They'll try to take us alive initially," Chester assessed, his special forces background evident in the way he analyzed their enemy's probable approach. "But if we resist effectively, they'll shift to a kill or capture mentality. Either way, we can't let them get close enough for hand-to-hand combat." Scout's sudden alertness interrupted their planning session. The dog's ears pricked toward sounds beyond human perception, his training allowing him to detect movement patterns that suggested coordinated approach rather than natural wildlife activity. Chester joined him at the window, using binoculars to scan the tree line for signs of their enemy's positioning. "They're moving into final approach positions," Chester reported quietly. "Professional spacing, multiple approach routes, probably planning a simultaneous assault from several directions." Catherine felt her heart rate accelerate as the reality of impending combat settled over her like a weight. Her corporate world had involved psychological warfare and financial maneuvering, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility of actual violence, actual death, actual bullets fired with intent to kill. "I need you to understand something," Chester said, turning from the window to meet her eyes with steady resolve. "Once this starts, there's no going back. These men aren't going to accept surrender, and they're not planning to leave witnesses. If we fight to win, which means we fight to kill." The words should have terrified Catherine, but instead she found herself feeling something she couldn't immediately identify: determination mixed with protective fury. Marcus's betrayal hadn't just threatened her life, it had endangered this good man who'd shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. "I understand," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "What do you need me to do?" Chester's tactical planning revealed the depth of his military experience. He'd spent years thinking about how to defend his mountain sanctuary, not from corporate assassins specifically, but from any threat that might disturb the peace he'd built with Martha. The cabin's construction included features that weren't immediately obvious: reinforced walls, strategic firing positions, escape routes that only someone familiar with the terrain could use effectively. The cabin's built like a fortress, Chester explained, showing Catherine how certain windows had been designed to serve as firing positions while remaining concealed from outside observers. Martha thought I was being paranoid, but she humored an old soldier's need to feel secure. Catherine understood that Martha's tolerance for Chester's preparations had been an act of love, allowing her husband to create the psychological safety he needed to heal from whatever wounds he'd carried. Home from Vietnam. Now those same preparations might save both their lives. Scout's role is early warning and tactical support, Chester continued, scratching behind the dog's ears with affection that belied their dangerous circumstances. He can move through terrain that would stop a human, and his training includes both reconnaissance and direct action when necessary. The old dog's tail wagged once at the familiar military terminology, and Catherine realized that both Chester and Scout were drawing on skills they'd hoped never to need again. Their peaceful mountain retirement was being transformed into active combat deployment by forces beyond their control. Chester's preparation included positioning weapons and ammunition at strategic points throughout the cabin, creating multiple defensive positions that would allow them to maintain resistance even if their enemies breached the main structure. His movements were economical, efficient, marked by the kind of muscle memory that came from years of similar preparations in hostile territory. The key is to make them pay a price for every advantage they think they have, Chester explained, his voice carrying the authority of hard-earned experience. Superior numbers don't mean much if they can't bring those numbers to bear effectively. This mountain gives us tools they don't understand and can't counter. Catherine's laptop chimed with an incoming message, and her blood ran cold as she read Marcus's final communication. "It's from Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's offering to negotiate." Chester joined her at the computer, reading over her shoulder as Marcus's message spelled out terms that revealed the true scope of his ambitions. He wanted the encryption keys, Catherine's cooperation in transferring control of Veilcore's assets, and her public endorsement of his leadership transition. In exchange, he promised a quick death rather than the prolonged interrogation his team was prepared to conduct. "He's lying," Chester said flatly. "Even if you gave him everything he wanted, he couldn't afford to leave witnesses. This is psychological warfare, designed to make you think you have choices when you really don't." Catherine stared at the screen, understanding that Marcus's message represented her final glimpse of the man she'd once trusted completely. The person who'd helped her build Veilcore from a startup into a global technology leader had been replaced by someone willing to murder for profit, someone who'd corrupted her son's relationship with his father to serve his own ambitions. "He's going to learn something about choices," Catherine said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. "Chester, how do we make them regret coming to your mountain?" Chester's smile was cold, predatory, marked by the kind of anticipation that came from finally having a worthy enemy to face. "We remind them that some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some old soldiers never really forget how to fight dirty." Outside, the morning light revealed movement in the tree line as Marcus's team completed their encirclement of the cabin. The battle for Catherine's life was about to begin, but Chester understood that they were fighting for something far more precious than survival. They were fighting for the right to choose their own ending to a story that had begun with simple kindness and unexpected love. Scout's low growl served as the only warning they received before the first tactical team breached the tree line. Chester watched through his binoculars as 4 men moved with military precision toward the cabin's eastern approach. Their movements coordinated but predictable to someone who'd spent decades studying enemy tactics in hostile terrain. "Contact east," Chester whispered into the radio headset he'd rigged for Catherine. 4 operators, standard advance formation. They think they're being subtle. Catherine, crouched behind the reinforced window that overlooked the cabin's western approach, her hands steady on the rifle. Chester had taught her to use during their brief but intensive training session. The weapon felt foreign in her grip, but determination had given her focus that surprised them both. The handmade sling Chester had crafted during their preparation lay beside him on the windowsill, a simple weapon that spoke to his mountain ingenuity and tactical creativity. Carved from seasoned oak and fitted with leather that had once been part of Martha's favorite belt, the sling represented everything these corporate mercenaries didn't understand about fighting on terms that favored survival over technology. "Remember what we practiced," Chester said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had kept soldiers alive in Vietnamese jungles. "Controlled breathing, clear sight picture, squeeze, don't pull. These men are professionals, but they're fighting on my mountain now." The first shots came from the south, suppressing fire designed to pin them down while the main assault teams moved into position. Chester had expected this approach, textbook urban warfare tactics adapted to wilderness conditions, effective against conventional enemies, but vulnerable to someone who understood the terrain intimately. Chester's response was immediate and devastating. The sling sent a fist-sized river rock through the morning air with deadly accuracy, striking the lead mercenary's night vision goggles and sending him tumbling backward into his teammates. The projectile's impact echoed through the forest like a gunshot, and Chester was already loading another stone before the first target hit the ground. "Movement west," Catherine reported, her voice tight but controlled. 2 men approaching through the pine grove. Chester's tactical planning revealed itself as the mercenaries discovered that their superior numbers couldn't be brought to bear effectively. The cabin's position on elevated ground, combined with natural obstacles that Chester had carefully preserved over 15 years, created choke points that forced the attackers into predictable killing zones. Scouts' contribution to their defense was both tactical and psychological. The old dog moved through terrain that would challenge human operators, appearing and disappearing among the rocks and fallen timber like a ghost with teeth. His attack on the Eastern team's communications specialist was swift and silent, eliminating their coordination advantage before they realized what had happened. "One down east," Chester reported, watching through his scope as Scout melted back into the forest after neutralizing his target. "The rest are regrouping, probably calling for instructions." Catherine's first shot took out a mercenary who'd underestimated both her resolve and Chester's training. The man had exposed himself while trying to flank their position, apparently believing that a corporate executive posed no serious threat. His mistake cost him his life and taught his surviving teammates that this operation wouldn't proceed according to their original assessment. The mountain itself became Chester's ally as he used his intimate knowledge of wind patterns, sight lines, and natural acoustics to multiply their defensive effectiveness. Every shot he fired seemed to come from a different position. Every tactical movement was masked by terrain features that confused enemy targeting systems designed for urban environments. "They're pulling back," Catherine observed, watching the surviving mercenaries retreat to positions that offered better cover but reduced their offensive capabilities. Regrouping for a different approach, Chester's sling had proven devastatingly effective against opponents who'd prepared for conventional weapons, but not for projectile systems that had been perfected by ancient warriors. His accuracy with the simple weapon was the result of years of practice, turning mountain stones into precision-guided munitions that struck without warning and left no muzzle flash to reveal his position. "Phase 1 complete," Chester announced with grim satisfaction. They came expecting to overwhelm an old man and a scared executive. Now they know they're fighting soldiers who happen to be defending their home. The brief lull in combat allowed them to assess their situation. 3 of the 8 mercenaries were down, 1 dead, 2 wounded seriously enough to remove them from active participation. The remaining 5 had taken cover in positions that limited their offensive options while buying time for their team leader to develop new tactics. Scout returned to the cabin with the fluid grace of a predator who'd successfully completed his mission. The old dog's muzzle showed traces of blood that didn't belong to him, evidence of close-quarters combat that had ended favorably for their side. "Good boy," Chester murmured, scratching behind Scout's ears while maintaining his watch on the tree line. "Martha would be proud of how you're protecting our family." Catherine felt a surge of emotion at Chester's casual reference to family, understanding that their shared danger had forged bonds that went beyond gratitude or convenience. She was no longer just a rescued stranger, she was someone worth fighting for, someone whose survival justified awakening skills that Chester had hoped never to use again. The first phase of their defense had succeeded beyond Chester's expectations, but he knew that the surviving mercenaries would adapt their tactics and return with approaches designed to counter the advantages that had served them well initially. The real test of their survival would come when professional soldiers stopped underestimating their opposition and began fighting the kind of war they'd been trained to win. Catherine's corporate seal ring caught the afternoon light as she positioned her laptop for what might be the most important video conference of her life. The heavy gold band bore the Veilcore logo that had once represented her life's work, but now it would serve as evidence in exposing the conspiracy that had driven her to this mountain sanctuary. "Live stream is ready," Catherine announced, her fingers steady on the keyboard despite the chaos surrounding their defensive position. Every major tech journalist, Veilcore board member, and regulatory agency that matters will receive this broadcast simultaneously. Chester maintained his overwatch position, tracking the surviving mercenaries who'd regrouped for what appeared to be a final assault. Marcus Webb himself had moved closer to the action, his expensive outdoor gear making him easily identifiable among his hired soldiers. The corporate executive's presence on the battlefield spoke of desperation. He needed those encryption keys badly enough to risk personal exposure. "Broadcasting in 3, 2, 1, Catherine said, her voice carrying across the mountain air as she began the testimony that would either save or damn them both. "My name is Catherine Vale, CEO of Veilcore Technologies. I'm speaking to you from a remote location in Colorado, where I'm currently under attack by mercenaries hired by my business partner, Marcus Webb. For the past 18 months, Marcus has been systematically embezzling company funds, selling our medical AI technology to authoritarian regimes, and planning my assassination to cover his crimes." The livestream's viewer count climbed rapidly as news organizations picked up the feed and shared it across their networks. Catherine's corporate seal ring served as authentication. Only the real CEO would possess the device needed to authorize such a broadcast from Veilcore's secure servers. Scouts bark from the eastern perimeter warned of renewed movement. The surviving mercenaries had split into 2 teams, attempting a coordinated assault that would force Chester to divide his attention between multiple threats. But the old soldier had anticipated this tactic, positioning defensive measures that would channel their attack into predetermined killing zones. "Second wave incoming," Chester reported, his combat knife ready for close-quarters work if the enemy reached their inner defensive perimeter. "They're committed now, no retreat options left." Catherine continued her broadcast, even as gunfire erupted around the cabin. "The evidence of Marcus Webb's crimes is contained in encrypted files that I'm uploading to secure servers as I speak. Financial records, communications with foreign agents, plans for converting our life-saving medical technology into tools of oppression and surveillance." The mercenaries' approach was more cautious this time, their movements reflecting respect for the casualties they'd already sustained. But caution worked against them on Chester's Mountain, where every delay allowed him to reposition and coordinate with Scout, maximum defensive effectiveness. Chester's sling sent another precisely aimed stone through the forest canopy, striking a mercenary who'd thought himself concealed behind adequate cover. The man's cry of pain and surprise echoed through the trees, and his teammates realized that their enemy possessed capabilities that defied conventional tactical expectations. Marcus Webb is currently directing this assassination attempt from a position approximately 200 yards southeast of my location, Catherine announced, her laptop's camera capturing the muzzle flashes and tactical movements that proved her words. He's willing to commit murder to steal technology that could revolutionize medical treatment worldwide. The psychological impact of Catherine's broadcast began manifesting immediately. Chester could hear increased radio chatter from the mercenary teams, urgent communications that spoke of operations being compromised and clients demanding immediate results, regardless of exposure risks. Scouts' flanking maneuver caught the Western assault team completely off guard. The old dog's military training allowed him to move through terrain that channeled human movement, appearing behind enemy positions with the kind of tactical surprise that had been perfected in Vietnam. His attack on their communications specialist eliminated their coordination advantage and sent the survivors scrambling for defensive positions. "Download complete," Catherine announced, her voice carrying triumph that was audible even over the sound of combat. The evidence is now distributed to servers in 12 countries, protected by the same encryption protocols that Marcus has been trying to steal. His crimes are permanent record, beyond his ability to suppress or modify. Chester's final tactical gambit revealed the depth of his mountain warfare expertise. Using controlled explosions, mining charges he'd stored for clearing rock slides, he triggered a controlled avalanche that blocked the mercenaries' only viable retreat route. The surviving attackers found themselves trapped between Chester's defensive position and terrain that had become impassable. Marcus Webb's voice carried across the battlefield, desperate and furious, as he realized that his carefully planned operation had become a public disaster. "Stand down. All teams stand down. The operation is compromised." But surrender wasn't an option for mercenaries who'd committed multiple felonies in full view of Catherine's global audience. The surviving professionals understood that their only choices were escape or elimination of all witnesses, and Chester's tactical positioning had made escape impossible. The final confrontation would be between Marcus himself and the two people who'd exposed his conspiracy to the world. Corporate warfare had become personal vendetta, fought with weapons and skills that had been learned in very different conflicts, but applied with deadly effectiveness to protecting what mattered most. Catherine's broadcast had saved Valecore and exposed the conspiracy, but the battle for their lives would be decided by Chester's combat knife and the courage they'd discovered in each other during their brief but transformative time together on his mountain sanctuary. The new collar around Scout's neck bore both their names, now Chester and Catherine, engraved in simple script that spoke of permanence rather than temporary arrangement. 6 months had passed since the mountain battle that had exposed Marcus Webb's conspiracy and transformed two lives in ways that neither could have anticipated when a blizzard first brought them together. Catherine stood on the cabin's expanded porch, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below, while Scout supervised the construction workers who were adding a modern office wing to Chester's rustic sanctuary. The addition respected the cabin's original character while providing the technology infrastructure that would allow Valecore's new Colorado headquarters to operate from this remote mountain location. The Denver lawyers called again, Catherine announced as Chester emerged from the workshop carrying a rocking chair that would join Martha's other furniture in their shared living space. Marcus's sentencing hearing is next week. They think he'll get 25 years for the conspiracy charges alone. Chester nodded with satisfaction that held no vindictiveness. Justice served was different from revenge taken, and he'd learned long ago that the former brought peace while the latter only perpetuated cycles of violence. Marcus Webb would spend his remaining years understanding the cost of betraying trust and corrupting noble purposes. The rocking chair bore Chester's distinctive craftsmanship, but its design incorporated elements that spoke of collaboration rather than solitary creation. Catherine had suggested modifications that improved both comfort and aesthetics, her input transforming good work into something approaching art. Their partnership extended beyond survival now, encompassing the kind of creative cooperation that built lasting relationships. "Danny called this morning," Chester said quietly, settling the chair in its designated spot beside the one he'd made for Martha years earlier. "He wants to visit next week, meet his stepmother properly." The reconciliation with his son had been slow and painful, complicated by Danny's guilt over his unwitting role in Marcus's conspiracy. But truth had a way of clearing away deceptions, and blood relationships could survive betrayal when forgiveness was offered genuinely. Catherine's presence had given Chester the emotional stability needed to rebuild bridges he'd thought permanently burned. Scout's obvious contentment with their expanded family unit was evident in his relaxed patrol of the property. The old dog moved with the dignity of a patriarch overseeing his domain, secure in the knowledge that his humans had found happiness together. His military training remained sharp, but now it served protection rather than warfare, guardianship rather than combat. Valecor's transformation under Catherine's renewed leadership had become a model for ethical technology development. The company's AI systems continued advancing medical diagnostics, while new safeguards prevented the military applications that Marcus had secretly pursued. Their mountain headquarters had become a pilgrimage site for entrepreneurs seeking to build companies that served humanity rather than exploiting it. The Shanghai contracts were terminated, Catherine reported, checking her tablet for the latest corporate communications. "Our former partners weren't happy about losing access to our technology, but they understood that working with us meant accepting our ethical guidelines." Chester appreciated Catherine's ability to navigate complex business relationships while maintaining the moral clarity that had attracted him to her character. She'd learned mountain wisdom about choosing battles carefully and fighting only for causes worth defending, but she'd retained the corporate skills necessary to protect their shared work from future corruption. The morning routine they'd developed reflected both their personalities. Catherine's efficiency merged with Chester's deliberate pacing, technology integrated with traditional mountain rhythms. Their coffee was still strong and black, but now it accompanied discussions of global business strategy alongside weather patterns and wildlife observations. Scout's attention to the access road alerted them to approaching visitors, but his relaxed posture indicated friends rather than threats. The vehicle that emerged from the tree line carried the logo of the local sheriff's department, and the man who stepped out wore the familiar uniform of someone who'd become both ally and friend during the aftermath of their mountain battle. "Morning, folks," Sheriff Rodriguez called out, approaching with the easy confidence of someone welcome at their table. "Thought you'd want to know that the last of Marcus's hired guns was sentenced yesterday. 20 years for conspiracy and attempted murder." Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The legal proceedings had been thorough but lengthy, and knowing that all the mercenaries were safely behind bars brought closure to a chapter of her life that had been marked by constant vigilance and justified paranoia. "Any word on the international connections?" Chester asked, pouring coffee for their guest with the hospitality that came naturally to mountain folk. "FBI's still working those cases," Rodriguez replied, accepting the mug gratefully. "Sounds like Marcus's operation was bigger than anyone realized, but cutting off the head killed the whole network. Your testimony pretty much destroyed any chance of the technology being used for oppression." The conversation moved to lighter topics, local news, weather predictions, Scout's status as an unofficial mascot for the sheriff's department. Rodriguez had become a regular visitor, drawn by Catherine's corporate insights and Chester's practical wisdom, finding in their mountain sanctuary a perspective that helped him navigate the complexities of law enforcement in changing times. As afternoon settled over their mountain home, Catherine and Chester stood together on the porch they'd expanded to accommodate their shared life. The valley below showed the first hints of autumn color, aspens beginning their transformation from summer green to the gold that would mark another seasonal cycle on their mountain. "Do you ever regret leaving San Francisco?" Chester asked, his arm around Catherine's shoulders as they watched Scout patrol the perimeter of their domain. Catherine considered the question seriously, thinking about the corporate boardrooms and urban sophistication she'd abandoned for mountain silence and simple pleasures. The life she'd built with Chester was smaller in scope, but larger in meaning, less impressive to outside observers, but infinitely more satisfying to the people actually living it. "Never," she said finally, meaning it completely. "This is where I learned the difference between being successful and being happy. This is where I learned that the best partnerships are about becoming better people together." Scout returned from his patrol and settled beside them, his worn collar bearing their combined names like a declaration of belonging. The three of them watched the sun set behind the peaks that had become their shared horizon, understanding that some rescues save more than lives, they save souls, hearts, and the possibility of love that transcends all the barriers that people create between themselves and happiness. Their mountain had witnessed the transformation of strangers into family, corporate executives into partners, and isolated individuals into a community of choice. The ending they'd written together was better than any they could have imagined separately, proving that sometimes the best stories begin with simple kindness and unexpected second chances.